March 1967, Oakland, California. There were not 400 cadets. There were fewer, 32 by most accounts. But every man in that room would later describe it as feeling like hundreds were watching, because no one spoke, no one moved, and no one forgot what they saw. Bruce Lee never publicly acknowledged the challenge. The police training hall had been cleared after hours. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The mats were thin, barely enough to soften impact. A wooden clock on the wall marked time with a sharp, mechanical click that witnesses would later remember more vividly than the strike itself. The dare had already been issued days before. It was not theatrical, not public. It was personal. A senior instructor, name partially withheld in records, referred to in two separate testimonies as H. Lawson, had questioned whether Lee's methods could function under pressure from a trained, resisting opponent. Not a student, not a demonstration partner, someone who intended to hurt him. Bruce agreed. What happened next lasted less than 15 seconds. One witness would later say it ended too fast to understand. Another would say it ended exactly when it needed to. But they all agreed on one detail. Bruce Lee stopped before he had to. And that decision, more than the speed, more than the technique, is what stayed with them. The man who issued the challenge did not return to teach the next week. No official report was filed. No photographs exist. Only fragments remain, conflicting, incomplete, and quietly passed between those who were in the room. And in those fragments, a different version of Bruce Lee begins to appear. Not a performer, not a philosopher, something far more difficult to control. By that year, Bruce Lee was no longer an unknown figure moving between small demonstrations and private students. He had already left Seattle behind, already challenged established schools, already begun shaping what he would later formalize as Jeet Kune Do. But in Oakland, his reputation was unstable, respected in some circles, quietly resisted in others. James Lee's garage had become a testing ground months earlier. Not a formal school, not a commercial space. It was a narrow, concrete-floored structure where techniques were stripped down and rebuilt under pressure. The ceiling was low enough that taller men had to be aware of their head movement. The air carried the smell of iron plates and old leather from improvised equipment. This was where Bruce refined what he believed worked and discarded what didn't. But outside that garage, especially among traditional instructors and law enforcement trainers, his ideas were viewed with caution or irritation. Police defensive tactics in the 1960s were built on structure, predefined responses, compliance holds, control through leverage. Bruce's approach rejected that rigidity. He emphasized interception, directness, speed over form. To some, it looked efficient. To others, it looked undisciplined. More importantly, it looked unproven. Dan Inosanto would later recall in a 1970 interview fragment that Bruce was increasingly frustrated during this period. Not because people doubted him, but because they doubted without testing. He wanted pressure, resistance, not demonstrations where partners cooperated. He had already experienced one privately arranged challenge years earlier, an encounter that left him dissatisfied with his own performance. Not because he lost, but because it took too long. That memory stayed with him. It reshaped how he trained, reduced tolerance for inefficiency, increased urgency in every movement. By early 1967, that urgency was visible. Students noticed it first. He was faster, but not just faster. One former trainee, identified in archived notes as Carl M., described. He was shorter with people, not angry, just less willing to explain. He wanted you to feel it. That shift created distance. Some instructors within the Oakland police training community had begun hearing about Lee through demonstrations and word of mouth. Reports of speed, reports of unconventional strikes, reports that didn't quite align with what they taught their cadets. To them, this mattered, because if Lee was right, even partially, it implied their methods might fail under real resistance. That tension did not stay theoretical for long. The training hall where the incident would later occur was used regularly for controlled scenario drills, arrest simulations, close quarters restraint practice. The environment favored predictability, clear sequences, known outcomes. Bruce did not fit into that system. Accounts suggest the initial invitation was informal, someone curious, possibly even respectful, asking him to demonstrate. But within days, that curiosity sharpened into skepticism. And skepticism, in that environment, rarely remained polite. H. Lawson, as referenced in two separate witness statements collected years later, was not a novice. He was an experienced instructor, mid-30s, solid build, known for insisting on realism during training sessions. He had seen techniques fail when tested under stress. He had little patience for theory that couldn't withstand resistance. According to one partial transcript, Lawson's criticism was direct. Speed isn't control. Anyone can move fast when nobody's trying to stop them. It wasn't said publicly, but it reached Bruce. And that is where the situation changed. Because for Bruce Lee, criticism alone was never the issue. It was the implication behind it, that what he was building might not hold up when someone truly intended to break it. He had already lived through that doubt once. He was not willing to repeat it. So when the invitation shifted from demonstration to challenge, he did not hesitate. But he did set one condition: no spectators beyond those already training. No annoncement, no performance, just a test. What neither side fully acknowledged at the time was how much was being placed on that moment. For Lawson, it was a question of validity, whether this unconventional approach could withstand structure resistance. For Bruce, it was something more internal, a need to prove that he had corrected what once failed him. And beneath that, a quieter concern, not whether he could win, but how far he might go if pushed to do it quickly. Do you want me to expand Chapter 2 now? Yes, Chapter 2. The challenger, the man identified in later accounts as H. Lawson, does not appear in any official roster tied directly to Bruce Lee. There are no photographs placing them in the same room. No signed statements. What exists are overlapping descriptions, consistent enough in detail to suggest a real figure, but fragmented enough to keep him partially obscured. Mid-30s, approximately 5 feet 11 inches, between 190 and 200 pounds. Former military, according to one witness. Another describes him as having the posture of someone used to command, which often meant shoulders squared, chin level, weight distributed evenly, never casual, even at rest. More important than his build was his reputation inside the training hall. He was not known for demonstration. He was known for correction. A former cadet, Michael R., who would later recount the evening in a taped interview from 1981, described Lawson's sessions as uncomfortable in a way that stayed with you. He didn't show you what to do, Michael said. He showed you what happened when you did it wrong. And he didn't slow down for that. Lawson specialized in close-quarters control, grappling transitions, joint manipulation, pressure application. Not traditional martial arts in the formal sense, but functional systems built around restraint and compliance. His techniques were meant to end resistance, not exchange strikes. That distinction mattered, because Bruce Lee's approach, interception, striking, forward pressure, operated on a different assumption. But the fastest way to end a confrontation was to disrupt it immediately. Lawson did not agree. In one partial recollection, he dismissed Lee's methods as first-move dependency, effective only if the opponent hesitated or failed to respond correctly. What happens, he reportedly asked during a closed discussion, when the other man doesn't freeze? It wasn't a rhetorical question. Lawson had tested men who didn't freeze. Drunk suspects, combative detainees, individuals who resisted unpredictably, with no concern for form or structure. He had seen techniques collapse under pressure, seen trained individuals lose control of situations they believed they understood. That experience shaped his skepticism. To him, Lee's speed was real, but speed alone did not guarantee control, and control was everything. Physically, Lawson was not faster than Bruce. Multiple witnesses agree on that point. But he was not slow. His movements were compact, economical. No motion. When he closed distance, he did so with intent to secure, not to exchange. One detail appears consistently across testimonies: his grip strength. A cadet recalled watching Lawson demonstrate a wrist control technique earlier that week. The partner attempted to pull free. Couldn't. The joint was not violently twisted. just held at an angle that made resistance ineffective. It didn't look like much, the cadet said, but the guy's face changed. You could see it hurt. That kind of control posed a specific threat to someone like Bruce. Because if Lawson managed to close distance and establish contact, solid contact, the fight would shift away from striking into entanglement. And in that range, speed becomes harder to apply cleanly. Lawson understood that. More importantly, he trusted it. There is no evidence he sought publicity from the encounter. No indication he intended to embarrass Bruce publicly. If anything, the opposite appears true. The challenge was kept contained, limited to those already inside the training environment. But that does not mean it was casual. He wasn't trying to prove a point to the room, Michael R. later said. He was trying to prove it to himself. That distinction gave the situation weight. Because a man testing himself is often more dangerous than one performing for others. In the days leading up to the meeting, Lawson reportedly increased the intensity of his sessions. Longer holds, faster transitions, less verbal instruction. One cadet described it as preparing without saying he was preparing. Bruce, meanwhile, did not respond publicly. No recorded statements. No visible adjustments in routine. But those close to him noticed something similar, an increase in focus, a narrowing of attention during training. He had faced skilled opponents before, but this situation carried a different kind of risk. Not reputational, structural. If Lawson succeeded in closing distance and controlling him, even briefly, it would challenge the core assumption Bruce was building his system on, that interception could prevent engagement before it fully formed. And if that assumption failed under pressure, everything built on it would need to be reconsidered. Neither man framed it that way out loud, but both understood what was being tested. It was not just skill, it was approach. And once the conditions were agreed upon, there was no neutral outcome left. Do you want me to expand Chapter 3 now? Yes, Chapter 3. The conditions the session was scheduled after regular hours. No announcement was posted. No formal invitation was issued. Those present were already part of the training rotation. Cadets finishing drills, one assistant instructor, and two observers who had remained behind under the assumption that something unusual was about to take place. The room itself was functional, not designed for exhibition. Rectangular, approximately 30 feet across, 40 feet in length. Low industrial ceiling with exposed fixtures. Fluorescent lights produced a steady, faint hum that several witnesses would later recall with unusual clarity. The floor was covered with thin mats, worn in places, seams slightly uneven. Not ideal for impact, not intended for prolonged grappling. At one end of the room, a wooden clock hung slightly crooked. It ticked loudly enough to be noticed when the room fell silent. Bruce arrived without an entourage. Dark training clothes. No protective gear. No visible preparation beyond a brief period of loosening his shoulders and shifting his weight from foot to foot. One witness noted that he paced the length of the mat once, measured it visually, then stopped near the center. Lawson entered shortly after. He removed his outer shirt, folded it, and placed it on a chair against the wall. Underneath, a plain white undershirt. No ceremonial gesture. No attempt to control the room. He acknowledged Bruce with a nod, nothing more. No referee stepped forward. That absence was not discussed. It was understood. A senior cadet, identified in notes as the Harris, stood near the edge, arms crossed, not to officiate but to observe. He would later say, nobody wanted to be responsible for stopping it too early or too late. The rules, if they could be called that, were minimal. No weapons, no eye gouging. Everything else remained undefined. There was no agreement on duration, no point system, no formal signal to begin beyond mutual readiness. One witness recalled a brief exchange, quiet enough that only those closest could hear it. Lawson, you go when you're ready. Bruce, I don't wait. The statement was not delivered as a threat, more like a clarification. Distance was established naturally, approximately 6 to 7 feet apart, just outside immediate striking range, but close enough that either man could close the gap in less than a second. The space between them felt deliberate, measured. Neither rushed to reduce it. The room shifted. Conversations stopped completely. Even those who had remained skeptical in the days prior recognized that this was no longer a theoretical discussion. The environment changed from training to observation, every movement now carrying consequence. Michael R., positioned along the far wall, would later describe a specific detail. No one adjusted their stance. No one shuffled. It was like the room itself didn't want to interfere. Bruce's posture appeared loose at first glance. Hands active, but not rigid. Lead side slightly forward. Weight balanced, but ready to shift. His eyes fixed, not on Lawson's face, but slightly lower, near the upper chest. Tracking center mass. Lawson's stance contrasted it. More squared, less mobile at first glance, but stable. Hands positioned to intercept or capture. His focus was direct. Eyes locked higher, reading shoulders and head movement. Two different systems, visible before contact. Speed versus control. Interception versus containment. The clock ticked once. Then again. Neither man spoke further. What witnesses would later struggle to agree on is the exact moment the engagement began. Some say Bruce moved first. Others insist Lawson initiated by shifting his weight forward, prompting the response. But all accounts align on one point. There was no gradual build. No circling. No testing phase. The distance collapsed suddenly. And whatever hesitation might have existed before that moment disappeared completely. No one in the room agreed on who initiated, but they all agreed on the speed. Michael R. would later describe it as a gap that didn't exist anymore. One moment there was distance, measurable, controlled, and in the next, both men were inside it, committed. Bruce moved on a forward line. Not wide, not angled, direct. His lead foot slid in first, short, efficient, barely lifting off the mat. The rear foot followed immediately, closing the gap with a sharp compression of space. At the same time, his lead hand shot forward. Not a full extension, but a probing strike aimed toward the face, designed less to land cleanly and more to occupy Lawson's vision. Lawson did not retreat. That was the first shift. Instead of giving ground, he stepped in. His weight drove forward off his rear leg, shoulders tightening as his hands rose, not to block in the traditional sense, but to intercept the line of Bruce's arm. His right hand made contact at the forearm, redirecting it slightly off-center, while his left moved toward Bruce's wrist. It was an attempt to establish control immediately, and for a fraction of a second, it worked. Witnesses recall Bruce's lead arm being checked, not stopped entirely, but disrupted enough to prevent a clean strike. Lawson's grip closed briefly at the wrist, his body already turning to bring his other side into play. Had that hold settled, the exchange would have shifted. But Bruce did not allow the second beat. His response came before Lawson could secure position. Instead of pulling back, Bruce drove further in. His rear hand fired straight down the center, short, compact, with no visible windup. It made contact high on Lawson's chest, just below the collarbone. Not a full power strike, but enough to interrupt structure. At the same time, his lead arm rotated, not away from the grip, but through it. Witnesses describe it differently. One twist, like he slipped out without pulling. What appears consistent is that Bruce didn't fight the grip directly. He changed the angle of his arm while advancing his body, forcing Lawson's hold to break under motion rather than resistance. The distance collapsed fully. Now they were inside each other's frame. Lawson adjusted quickly. His right arm dropped to re-engage, attempting to loop behind Bruce's elbow while his left hand came up toward the neck, setting up a clinch that would have allowed him to control posture and begin a takedown sequence. He was close enough. His forearm made contact with Bruce's upper arm. His shoulder began to turn. For a moment, the direction of the exchange tilted in his favor. Then Bruce shifted again. Not backward, not laterally, down and forward. His center of gravity dropped sharply, just a few inches, but enough to change the alignment of both bodies. At the same time, his lead leg stepped slightly outside Lawson's stance, disrupting the base Lawson was building for control. Another strike followed. Short, upward, not aimed at the head, into the body, just under the rib line. One witness, positioned to the side, recalled the sound more than the motion. A dull impact, he said. Not loud, but you could hear it land. Lawson's posture reacted. Not dramatically. He did not fall, but his torso tightened. His forward pressure paused for a fraction longer than before. That pause was enough. Bruce's hands did not reset. They continued. A rapid sequence. 2, possibly 3 short strikes, centerline focused. Not wide punches. Compact motions designed to land before a full defensive response could form. Lawson attempted to re-establish grip. His hands moved again toward Bruce's arms, but now the timing was different. Each attempt met interruption. Contact before completion. His structure, which had been forming seconds earlier, now struggled to stabilize under continuous pressure. The room changed with it. Witnesses who had expected a slower engagement, a test of holds, transitions, counters, began to realize that the exchange was not unfolding in phases. It was compressing, everything happening inside a space of seconds. Michael R. would later say that's when it stopped looking like 2 systems meeting and started looking like one man trying to catch up to something already in motion. But the exchange had not ended, because despite the disruption, Lawson was still upright, still inside range, and still trying to close. The exchange should have broken there. In most controlled training environments, that sequence, entry, disruption, 2 or 3 clean strikes, would have been enough to pause, reset, reassess. But nothing in this room had been defined to stop at enough. Lawson did not disengage. If anything, the pressure forced him further in. Witnesses describe a visible shift in his posture. Not collapse, but commitment. His shoulders tightened, his head dropped slightly forward to protect his center line, and he drove again into Bruce's space, accepting the strikes in order to reach contact. That decision carried risk. It also brought him closer to his objective. His right arm pushed through, this time deeper, slipping inside Bruce's lead side. His forearm made solid contact against Bruce's upper body, and for the first time, he established something more stable than a brief touch, a partial tie-up. One more second, and it might have turned into control. Bruce felt it. Several witnesses noted a change, not in speed, but in intent. Up to that point, his strikes had been measured, disruptive, precise. Now, there was a narrowing, less space between movements, less visible restraint. Lawson's left hand came up toward the back of Bruce's neck. If it secured, even briefly, it would anchor the clinch. Bruce responded before the grip closed. His head shifted offline. Small movement, just enough to avoid a direct capture, and his right hand drove forward again. This time the target was higher. The strike landed along the side of Lawson's face. Not a wide hook, but a tight, direct shot that snapped the head slightly off-center. Not enough to drop him. Enough to interrupt the alignment of his spine. Lawson's grip faltered, but he didn't release. Instead, he tightened his hold with the other arm, pulling inward, attempting to collapse the space completely. Their bodies made full contact now. Chest to shoulder, forearms pressing, balance contested at close range. This was the range Lawson trusted, and for a fraction of a second, it held. Michael R. described it as the only moment where it looked even. Both men rooted. No clear strikes landed. Just pressure, shifting weight, small adjustments, each trying to feel where the other would move next. Then Bruce made a decision. Not a visible one, not announced, but witnesses felt it in what followed. Instead of continuing to strike at the same level, he changed elevation again, slightly lower, compressing his stance further. His left hand checked Lawson's arm just enough to create a narrow line. And into that line, he drove a short, direct strike toward the throat. He did not fully extend it. That detail appears in every account. The motion was there, the trajectory clear, the distance closed, but the final inch was controlled. The contact, if any, was glancing. Lawson reacted immediately. His grip broke, not by force, but by reflex. His hands came up toward his neck, his body stepping back for the first time since the exchange began. That was the opening. Bruce followed, not with hesitation, but with acceleration. A final sequence, 2 fast, direct strikes, forced Lawson further off balance. His foot caught slightly on the edge of the mat seam, and his weight shifted unevenly backward. He didn't fall hard, but he went down. One knee, then his hand, catching himself before full impact. The room froze. Bruce was already in position to continue. Distance closed. Angle dominant. No obstruction between them. Lawson was exposed, and for the first time since the exchange began, there was a clear, uninterrupted path to end it with force. Witnesses describe the pause differently. Some say it lasted a second. Others insist it was shorter. But they all agree it existed. Bruce did not strike. His hands remained ready, but held. His posture forward but contained. He watched. Lawson stayed where he was for a moment. One knee on the mat, breathing controlled, but heavier now, one hand still near his throat. There was no immediate attempt to rise, no sudden counter. The fight had shifted beyond recovery, and both men knew it. Bruce stepped back first. One step, then another, creating space deliberately, signaling the end without announcement. No one spoke. Not immediately. The clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, filling the silence that followed. Lawson stood up on his own. No assistance offered. None requested. His face showed the first clear signs of damage. Slight swelling along the cheek, a tightening around the jaw. His breathing remained controlled, but slower now. He looked at Bruce. Not with anger. Not with dismissal. But with a level of recognition that had not been there before. Whatever question he had brought into that room, it had been answered. Just not in the way he expected. No formal conclusion was declared. There was no signal, no acknowledgement from an authority figure, no written report filed into departmental records. The session simply ended the way it had begun, without ceremony. But the room did not return to normal. Witnesses remained in place longer than necessary. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched Lawson as he moved back toward the chair where he had left his shirt. The ordinary sounds of training, footsteps, casual conversation, equipment being adjusted, did not resume immediately. It took time for movement to come back. Lawson dressed without assistance. One cadet would later recall that his hands were steady, but slower than before. There was a visible stiffness when he lifted his arm to pull the shirt over his head. The mark along his cheek had darkened slightly. No dramatic injury, nothing that required medical intervention, but enough to carry into the following days. He did not address the room. He nodded once, to no one in particular, and left. According to two separate accounts, he did not lead the next scheduled session. No explanation was given. Bruce remained for a short period after. He did not engage in discussion about what had occurred. One student attempted to ask a question, something about timing, about the entry, but Bruce reportedly shook his head and dismissed it with a brief response. Too slow. It was not clear whether he was referring to the student question, Lawson's approach, or something in his own execution. That ambiguity stayed with those who heard it, because from the outside, the encounter appeared decisive. Short, controlled, conclusive. But those who watched closely noticed something less resolved. Michael Lahr, in his later interview, described Bruce's demeanor in the minutes after Lawson left. He wasn't satisfied. That's what stood out. Everyone else was reacting. He wasn't. He was thinking. That detail aligns with what is known about Bruce during this period. He was not measuring success by outcome alone. He was measuring time, efficiency, the narrowing gap between intention and execution. And in this case, despite the brevity of the exchange, there had been a moment, brief, but real, where Lawson had established contact, where control had almost formed. That moment mattered to Bruce, more than the ending. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes appeared in his training. Shorter combinations, more emphasis on immediate interruption, ending engagements before they could transition into grappling range. Increased focus on what he would later describe as non-telegraphic movement, removing any signal that could be read or anticipated. Students noticed the difference. One described it as less forgiving. Another said he didn't want a second exchange anymore. The encounter was never publicly referenced in his writings or interviews. It does not appear in official timelines. No fotographs. No verified documentation. Only accounts, fragments, and the consistent agreement on one point. He could have done more, but he didn't. That decision, made in less than a second, under pressure with a clear path to continue, became the part that stayed with the witnesses. not because it showed restraint in a moral sense, but because it revealed something harder to define. Control over outcome, control over capacity, an understanding of exactly how far the situation could go, and a deliberate choice to stop before reaching it. Years later, when asked indirectly about real confrontations, Bruce would often redirect the conversation toward efficiency, toward ending conflict quickly. He rarely spoke about limits, but those who were in that room did, quietly, separately, without embellishment. And when their accounts are placed side by side, a consistent impression emerges, not of a man proving he could win, but of someone confronting how easily he could go further than necessary. The training hall was used again the next day. The mats remained the same. The clock continued its steady rhythm. New cadets entered without knowledge of what had taken place. Nothing in the environment marked the event, but for those who had witnessed it, the space carried a different weight. Not because of what happened, but because of what almost did, and how precisely it was avoided. The most dangerous moment wasn't when he struck, one witness would later say. It was when he chose not to.